I think we're live. Yes, we're live. Hello, everybody. This is Constance from Mysterious Galaxy. I want to say thank you so very, very much for joining us tonight. I am super excited because tonight we are celebrating Betty and Veronica, the bond of friendship by Jamie Rotante. Is it Rotante? I'm sorry if I did not.
Rotante, yep.
Sweet, yay! And then I'm just going to be in conversation with Alex Segura, who we did an event with earlier this year, where we celebrated Star Wars Poe Dameron Freefall. And that was super. I must say, you have to Vanna White your books. Come on, put love up for your books. The covers for both of your books are absolutely gorgeous. So
yes, he's very handsome.
I'm super excited because for Betty and Veronica, it is an amazing tale of friendship and things that sometimes go on in high school with some of our two favorite Archie female friends. I'm not going to say too much more about it, but we are offering some book kind of freaking awesome during the times and the given shenanigans and even the holidays, which is a perfect segue into saying, if you want to support this amazing book and these authors, you can always purchase their book and there will be a buy button down below for you that will say buy signed book. And also my other Anna White moment before I pass it over to Alex is going to be, if you have questions, make sure you ask them, because that's the most fun part of an event, is that you have at your mercy to ask almost anything. So if you have a question for them, make sure where it's a question down below. You click the guys at the end of the event. Have a good one. Wait, I don't know this.
I can kind of still hear you. It's like a heartbeat.
Oh,
well. Should we start?
yeah, I think we can. I think.
Yeah, we're here. You know, I saw her fading a little bit and I was worried for a second, but we, you know, this has happened to me before where I'm hosting a crowdcast and then I disappear and the show goes on because we're here. So I'm Alex Segura. I am co-president of Archie Comics, and Jamie Rotante is the writer of Betty and Veronica, The Bond of Friendship with the amazing Britney Williams. And so zooming out, Bond of Friendship, what's your elevator pitch, Jamie?
So Bond of Friendship it's a story about friendship, clearly, but it's a little bit bigger than that. It's about Betty and Veronica, and it's them exploring their futures. So the framework for that is that it takes place at a career day at Riverdale High School. And through the lens of these different professionals that come from different fields to talk about what they do, Betty and Veronica start to explore what is in their future and then how that possibly impacts their friendship along the way.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I did not cut out. Now I feel like I've awkwardly interrupted. You guys are good though. So I'm going to keep running. If you need anything, I'm here for you.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Where was I? Yes. So one of the big, you know, we talk about this all the time, and I feel like it always needs more attention, is the art of Britney Williams. And I think, you know, just out of the gate, she brings this timeless style that is not classic Archie, but it's not quote unquote new Archie either. You know, the process, you know, you're in a unique position because you're part of the editorial team at Archie and you're also a creator and you wrote this book, but you were also kind of seeing some of the stuff behind the scenes. And just talk us through the journey to teaming up with Britney and like realizing that this is going to be our first original graphic novel ever, and that this was the story we were going to go with. And what was it like for you kind of wearing both of those hats?
It was amazing. I think, especially starting this book and it being the first OGN, we couldn't have done it without someone like Britney. She was so fantastic. She's just like the perfect choice for this. Just like you said, Alex, her art style it's so just visually appealing, I think, to everyone, but especially to any and every Archie fan, because it really bridges that gap between the classic style and the more modern stuff we've done. It also has this really beautiful animated quality to it. Like the pages, like the illustrations fly off the pages. You could really just like picture what's going on. You could see it. It feels like a movie at times. She was fantastic to work with. I was so honored to get the chance to work with her. And it was it was such a cool experience just seeing her bring all of my words to life, you know, and not just seeing it as a writer, but seeing it from the whole editorial process. So like every step of the way, watching it go from just layouts to pencils to the final finished art. It's a very, very cool experience.
Yeah, and I feel like my vantage point was unique in that we talked about this a little bit before, that, you know, there's certain books that you have to kind of pinch yourself and remember, okay, I have to edit this book, I have to give notes, I have to think about this critically. And this was one of those books that I had to do that, especially, you know, there's other titles that we produce that are just kind of fun, you know, like Sabrina the Teenage Witch by Kelly and Veronica Fish. But this book also was just a pleasure, you know, because you and Brittany are so professional. The whole team is very professional in terms of deadline, so there was no worry about that. But you know, creatively, it just felt like the right story at the right time. Was there pressure? You know, I want to hear a little bit more about your connection to Archie as a fan. And was there pressure? No, once you realized, okay, this is going to be Archie Comics' first ever original graphic novel, and it's going to be Betty and Veronica, and I am writing it. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Definitely a little bit of pressure there.
Yeah.
Fortunately, it wasn't my first Betty and Veronica story to write,
right.
So that would have been way more intimidating.
Yeah, we're not that evil.
Definitely pressure and just upholding the legacy, and the fact that I get to sort of be a part of that is so cool. I think for me, aside from just like the bigger picture part of it is huge, but I tried not to think about that too much. The more immediate pressure was learning how to tell a story in an original graphic novel versus the monthly comics, because it is a different format, you know?
Yeah.
It's not even just like hitting deadlines, but you know, especially for our books, you have 20 pages to tell a story each chapter. And with this, it's like, well, if I need 30 pages to tell this part of the story, I can use that, but I might only need 10 this next chapter. And it was just sort of figuring out, like, I know how many pages I have overall, but how the story is going to flow is totally different from just, I have 20 pages, you know, I know where I have to hit all these beats. And that was more intimidating thinking about it than actually writing it. Like, once I kind of got into the groove and like plotted everything out, it made sense. But it was definitely a change. It's a noticeable difference.
What was your, I know a little bit about this, you know, I know you're very dialogue focused, but what's your process from story idea? Like, you know, you pitched the graphic novel, obviously we didn't just say go without knowing what it was going to be, but, you know, when did you go from there to the story? Like, what's your writing creative process usually for comics?
For comics, I'm way more outline driven than I am for like any other type of writing I do. And I think especially for this one, I had like 4 different sets of breakdowns from that initial pitch, because it was the like, okay, here's a way I could plot this out so it fits this time. Then here's chapter 1 and everything. Then here's like 5-page chunks breakdowns, and then inevitably like page by page breakdowns. And in doing that, it was great because it helped me figure out the flow, because I would start thinking like, oh, maybe I can just do every chapter 20 pages. And then in like really writing it out each time, realizing like, no. And then like certain scenarios that I just didn't get to include that I wanted to, because I ran out of space, not in that like, oh, I don't have enough room, just realizing I really want to dedicate more time to this section. And this one that I wanted to do because it seemed fun, I don't want to rush, because I'd rather exclude it than have something that feels really jammed in at the end. So doing all of the breakdowns definitely helped with that.
Yeah, I find that just in my experience, you kind of cater your process to the artist you're working with. Like, obviously, if you're dealing with an artist you don't know, you're going to write a much more detailed full script. Or with something else, like when I work with George on the Black Ghost, like I know their style, so I can kind of be more loose. So when you were working with Brittany, what was the kind of back and forth? You know, did you try to keep it sparse so she could then fill in the spaces, or just talk a little bit more about the dynamic?
Yeah, so it was such an honor working with Brittany, because she's somebody that I really wanted to work with for a long time.
Yeah.
But going into it, I didn't have that relationship with her, so I wasn't sure. And I had kind of conditioned myself to be way more detailed. I never want to be so detailed it feels like I'm telling the artist what to do, because trust me, any artist knows how to do it better than I could.
Right.
But it's also just a good experiment in understanding. Like, I want to have all of these details about the background, about where I want the characters to be facing. But I realized soon after that Brittany knows how to do it, but even some of the changes she would make and the choices she would make that were different from how I detailed were so much better than how I envisioned it. That like I feel like you could even see from like the prologue to how the scripts looked at the end. It was like a little more detailed, all of this, and then in the end it was way more sparse because it was just like Britt knows how to do this now. Like she does not need me to hold her hand. She never did, but like it was so cool seeing that. Like I don't want to give too many details because I trust her vision and I trust how she's going to bring it to life.
Yeah, no, and she did a fantastic job, and so did you. It's such a great synergy of both of your styles, and seeing the process, like seeing the pages come in, it was clear that you guys were really syncing up as the book progressed. Which isn't to say the first pages are any worse or whatever. It's just you kind of clicked into place, and there was much more of an understanding between you. So what are the what were there any challenges or any moments that kind of jumped out at you during the process as like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this, or like, just things that you had to, were a little more tricky to do. You've written Betty and Veronica before, so that wasn't new to you, but this feels like tried and true, iconic Betty and Veronica, as opposed to something like Vixens, where you've got a little more wiggle room, or Senior Year, which is, like we talked before, a little more continuity specific, like we're jumping forward, but this is iconic B&V. So can you talk a little bit more about that? Like any challenges or like pressure, not pressure, but just, just little memories of the process.
I would say in terms of challenges, so if anyone doesn't know, there's a lot of future scenarios in this, and then some of them kind of get really fantastical and out of this world. So, there's a scene where they're in outer space. Things like that, I never really have written before. I usually keep things more grounded in reality, even if it's an extreme form of reality, there's still something like that. So the challenge was like, how do I write action and sci-fi, even though it's still comedy, it's still classic Archie, but in a way that's not just, here are the characters having a conversation in space, there's got to be something more.
How does it feel like it has to happen in space?
Yeah. So that was a little bit of a challenge. I didn't find myself struggling with it too much, but it was definitely pushing me a little bit out of my comfort zone in a good way. Like I felt like it really helped. And I think, as you've mentioned, I'm a dialogue-driven person, but I felt like this was one where I really wanted to have that sort of, if you read our digest, if you read our classic stuff, you can pick this up and not feel like a culture shock or some sort of strange, like, I don't know what they're saying and I don't understand this. I wanted to keep my sort of dialogue that I feel like has its own style in my work, but also the very classic sensibilities and humor, which was really fun. Like, it was a very cool experiment to do, but that was a little bit intimidating because it's more of just that, like, okay, these characters have to be ones that anybody who picks it up, if they're new to this, they can jump right in. This is a story of teens and friendship. But if they're classic Archie fans, it could be like, yeah, that's exactly what Betty Cooper would say. That's exactly how Veronica would respond to that situation.
Yeah, it's a challenge. Before I hop into my next question, I just want to remind everyone that's watching, you can pick up a copy of the book. Just click on Buy Signed Book below. You can also pick up a copy of Poe Dameron Freefall, which is signed. And if you have a question, anything, and we'll ask away, you can just click on the Ask a Question button below my head, and we'll get to those in about 15 minutes or so. But one of the things that a lot of people may not know is that you are, having been at Archie for a while. I think we've both been there a long time. I left for a little while and then came back, so about a decade. But you're a student of the brand, and that's not just Archie as an idea, but you've read pretty much every Archie comic published to some degree, like at least every era, I think I can safely say.
Yeah.
And that's, you're I think it's, I can say you're a student of Archie and storytelling and the tropes of Archie. So, what things did you want to evoke in the OGN? Like what creators or story ideas and concepts really speak to you as a reader that you wanted to kind of toy with a little bit in your own work?
Well, so part of the scenarios that I came up with for like the futures and all that, a lot of those are a bit of an homage to stories that have happened in the past. Almost all of those we've seen Betty and Veronica do in some capacity. A lot of them are Dan Parent stories. Dan Parent is a legend. I'm so lucky that I get to work with him in some capacity still.
He's awesome.
Yeah, and a lot of his Betty and Veronica stories from the 90s were what shaped me as an Archie Comics fan and a reader. So that's probably one of my biggest personal influences when it comes to writing Betty and Veronica. But in terms of just storytelling over time, I feel like Sam Schwartz is so fantastic with comedy, and especially Jughead, and just writing characters that are aloof like that, where you have the sort of person where everything happens around him. I think is really cool, and I feel like to some element, Betty and Veronica have that, because there's a lot of scenes where they're just being themselves, and the craziness is what they're just sort of thrown into. And any classic Bob Montana and Harry Lucy stuff is always just master classes in comedic storytelling. Like, you can't go wrong with any of those.
Yeah, and it's so much is said with so few words. Like, it's very visual gags, and even Frank Doyle, like the iconic quote unquote writers, they did so much with so little. And it's like they say, if you write a good poem, you can write a good story because you learn how to manage your word count. So I think a lot of that is similar to comics. You can kind of watch what you say and say much more. And in terms of those stories that you read, like, were there beats or character moments that you really wanted to evoke in your own work, or was it just more kind of like letting your fandom speak and create your own thing?
I would say it's more of letting my fandom speak. A lot of the moments that I sort of pay respects to that Dan has done were mostly just like, hey, we can see these girls in the White House. Hey, we can see these girls in NASA. But I didn't want it to be straight up like, this was that story and this is me retelling it. It's just more this is how I would imagine it in that way.
Yeah, and one of the things I like about my job, and I know you like as well, is we get to see how these talented people do talented things. Like, I get to read, a Kelly Thompson script or an Alex DeCampi script or Nick Spencer or what have you, or Mark Waid, and you do as well, and see the art pages coming in. And can you talk a little bit about your journey with Archie, not just as an editor, but also creatively, like the other stuff you've worked on and what it's been like?
Yeah, so I've been doing editorial for a while now, which is definitely, as you've mentioned, like, it's very hands-on, even if just accidentally so, that I get to see these amazing writers and their approach. And it definitely
Team Dark Circle.
Yeah. And it's definitely helped me with, even just right down to formatting and seeing what, artists tend to respond to really well with and how a script is formatted. Mark Waid is fantastic with that. He's been a big influence in how I approach just the like laying it out and how you can get your artist to really understand. But as you've mentioned before, my first series that I wrote for Archie was Betty and Veronica Vixens, which is Betty and Veronica in a motorcycle gang, which is very trial by fire. If I could write that, I can write Betty and Veronica in any scenario. And that was so cool. Such a really interesting way to sort of dip my toes into this world by getting these two legendary characters and putting them in this insane situation. And then I went from that to a much more grounded in reality series with Betty and Veronica's senior year, which just is, a day in the life kind of story. It takes you every season throughout 1 year, which happens to be their senior year leading up to their graduation. That was really cool because I got to like really reflect on my own experience, being a teenager, and then think of, I do some mentoring with different groups, and I work with young women. And it was very interesting to be mentoring a senior in high school while writing that story, because there are definitely moments where I'm like, okay, that's what that pressure is like. I'm seeing it, I'm reliving it. And then Betty and Veronica, Bond of Friendship, which is definitely almost an extension of senior year in that it goes from like graduation to beyond, but more for an all ages audience, more fantastical, a little more in line with the classic spirit of the characters.
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked about this before, but for me, I think all good plot and conflict comes from character. You put the characters in a room and kind of see what they do and say, and I'm going to assume that you feel similarly, and just talking about dialogue and stuff like that. So with that in mind, just thinking about the characters, you're given the keys to these two iconic, the two biggest friends in comics and pop culture. I think when people think of best friends, they think of Betty and Veronica. So how do you see them? Like, how are they similar? How are they different? Like, they have this, this iconic conflict, but I also feel like that conflict is something that can be ignored, because it shouldn't just be about Archie. It shouldn't just be about this guy that they pine after. That's almost become secondary, and rightfully so. So I want to hear about, you know, how you see them and how they've evolved over time, and what kind of a stamp you've put on the characters, which is kind of cool to say.
Yeah, very cool. Absolutely. Yeah, in my writing personally, I've really tried to push them further and further away from the whole love triangle storyline. I think you can have, you know, in senior year, you see them have these romantic relationships and how sometimes that can affect their friendship, but it was more in that, like, how that can happen just in life. I think Archie is a hilarious character. Having them in scenes with him is great, but I always preferred stories where it was defined by their friendship, not their feuding over him. Or even if they were fighting and feuding, it was something that had nothing to do with him. Like, those could be entertaining too. And I think, you know, the age-old question has always been, why are they friends? How do you have two characters like this who fight over one guy and for some reason they're best friends? It's like, well, obviously there has to be a key there, especially when we're seeing stories when they're not fighting. And I think it's really just, my perspective is they see in each other what they either not necessarily lack, but what they hope to be in themselves. So, you know, Betty gets her confidence from Veronica, and Veronica gets her humility to some extent from Betty. It's that very yin-yang sort of approach, and that's something that I've really tried to highlight in my writing. And that's definitely an evolution we've seen over time, because it's funny, some of these stories from the 50s, even when they would be fighting over Archie, they would still come out as like these really strong characters that, you know, sometimes maybe Archie was the thing that made them fight, but then he takes a backseat and their personalities shine. And that's always been sort of played with. And over time, you can see him get slightly more removed from that dynamic and it be more about them. I think we had a series, it was when I first started working at Archie, called the Battle of the Bffs, which was them and all the female characters. But I thought that was a great one that really showed their friend dynamic and just like every female's dynamic in Riverdale. And that was something really cool to look at in my early stages of working at Archie, because it was that first time where I really saw all the female characters and their friendships just put on display in that way. And it definitely helped us not only who the characters are, but how they interact with each other.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think you see a lot of that. You pick up a lot of those threads and make them your own in not just Bond of Friendship, but in your other work. And what's interesting to me is you started writing Betty and Veronica with something like Vixens, which is so of the mold of things like Afterlife or Chilling Adventures. Not so much that it's horror, but it takes these iconic characters and puts them in a very unexpected setting. And then you shift over to senior year. So, you know, you do these big splashy things but they're very character driven stories. So when we had the discussion and I, if I'm remembering this correctly, I said we should do another B&V story, like think of something, you know, we want to do one. What made the Bond of Friendship, before we even knew it was an OGN, what made this the next story you wanted to do? Like, why did you want to explore friendship and their future? Like, what were they were going to do next? Like, why did it feel like the next thing for you?
It definitely took a little bit of tweaking to get to that point, even before I pitched it, because I just kept thinking, like, all right, logically, what would be the next step? We see them senior year. Is the next step college? Is the next step adulthood? But, you know, we've seen adulthood with the characters and life with Archie. We've never seen college, but I feel like that's an experience that's just not universal to everyone. So it's a little bit harder to write that way. And I'm like, well, it would be cool to see them in the future, but I want it to be fun. You know, if I want this to appeal to, you know, I don't want to say a younger audience. I want to say to everyone, but definitely something where I feel like you don't feel like, oh, I can't read that. It's too old for me. It's, you know, too mature. And it's like, how do we show them in the future? How do we show potential careers and their friendship there while still being fun and for all ages? And that was how it's like, okay, you don't have to actually put them in the future. You can just have them imagine it. So once that kind of clicked for me, it was like, that makes sense. And, you know, Career Day just lended itself as the perfect framework for that. And I'm like, that's something that's, you know, pretty universal too. Everyone can kind of relate to that.
Yeah, and it just opened up so many options for you, and I thought it was handled so well. And obviously, Brittany did an amazing job. But you know, one of the things about these characters, you talked about the dynamic between them so well. But one thing that's always interesting to me is to kind of talk about what makes them appealing? It's going to be 80 years next year for not only Archie, but Betty, Veronica, Jughead, and the core characters. So what is it for you as a reader and as a fan and now as a creator as well? Like, what is the appeal of writing Betty and Veronica for you?
Well, it's definitely, the character-driven part. I think it's just that their personalities and their archetypes are so strong. Everybody knows who Betty and Veronica are, and everybody has are you a Betty or are you a Veronica? Like, everyone knows immediately what that means. And that type of just personalities and archetype in writing has permeated throughout almost 80 years, that you can throw them into any scenario. But I think that's the appeal for readers too. It's the fun of seeing that in different worlds and in different universes, and like something like a digest story, but also something like a zombie horror story, and it works. But it's also that little bit of comfort. You know who these characters are, you know what drives them, you know what their personalities are like. So no matter what, you can pick up an Archie story and not know what they're going to do, but have that comfort in knowing that, Betty's going to try and help everybody. Archie's going to trip over something. And there's something about that familiarity that I think just appeals to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, there's a great comfort there. As someone who's also written a lot of Archies and read a lot. I was a fan before I was professional, and I think a lot of people are surprised when you say, "Oh, I work at Archie." You either get like, "Oh, it's good that that's still happening." I mean, obviously the awareness has grown so much that I don't get that as much. Like, people have connections to the IP, but when I started working at Archie, people were surprised that I would go from somewhere like DC with Batman and Superman to Archie. But to me, Archie is as iconic. It's such and the awareness is there. Like, you talk to somebody about Archie, everyone knows who these characters are. So it's really amazing that the brand is as vibrant as it has ever been, I think, and especially with stuff like Riverdale and Chilling Adventures. But I want to talk to you a little bit about other stuff that you're reading or watching that's kind of getting you excited. As writers, we're always kind of absorbing what's around us and picking things up. So are there books or comics that you've enjoyed that have kind of gotten you jazzed about your own creative work?
Yeah. Right now I'm reading Sweeney Boo's Eat and Love Yourself, which is amazing. And she's fantastic. We've worked with her. She's done some covers for us. She's awesome. That's been really exciting. I also put for my Christmas wish list, a haul of young adult books that I'm very excited to dive into. Right. I find myself reading more YA just for myself because, there's so many amazing books, and it's such a growing genre, even more so now. And I'm finding myself gravitating almost more to YA books and the different stories that I'm encountering in those than I am than anything else, really. So
that's interesting. Yeah. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Oh no, it's fine. It's not even, part of me says oh, it's just for research to hone into my writing, but really it's just because I enjoy everything that's coming out there.
Yeah, it's interesting because something like Poe Dameron, it's a YA Star Wars novel, but I didn't write it differently than I mean, it's different from a crime novel in that there's not as much, the rating is a little bit softer, but you can speak to this a little bit too. I mean, we knew the OGN was going to be quote unquote YA, but did that change your approach, or did you feel like you had to write in a different way, or was it just, is it more just of a marketing tool?
I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. I guess I definitely, as I've mentioned, I'm a very dialogue-driven person, and I think with the YA approach, it kind of made me pare back on that a little bit. I felt like a little more inclined to do more showing than telling, also because Britney's art is so beautiful. I wanted that to really, I didn't want a beautiful panel jammed with word balloons, to take away from that. But I think I just wanted it to be, I wanted there to be room to breathe on every page, so you get the story. I also read a lot of YA graphic novels as preparation for it to kind of get an idea, and some of the ones that I found to be really amazing were the ones that were less wordy, way more, even if it wasn't action, it was just beautiful illustrative moments that spoke to it. So that was definitely a slight tweak in my approach, not too much, but I think it also lends itself to marketing too, because it's, YA again has become such a huge genre that, it's a huge marketplace. You really want to make sure it lends itself to that and it stands out in that group.
For sure. Yeah. And before I ask, I have one more question. But before I ask, I want to remind everyone you can pick up a signed copy of Jamie's graphic novel, The Bond of Friendship. Just click on that green button below us. And if you have any questions, we will start to get to them in a few minutes. But you talked about this a little bit about your mentorship with young writers and young women. And I want to just slow down and talk about that a little bit more, because I think personally it's very important. I mentor other writers. I do this thing called Pitch Wars. And I think it's important to, help those that are still on the journey or like on an earlier rung of the ladder, I guess. So what's it been like for you, and just what have you kind of passed on to other writers or other people?
It's been an amazing experience. I think also, and you can speak to this as well, working in editorial, so much of what we do becomes routine. This is your day to day, that when you kind of get to step back and really like talk to somebody else and mentor them, it puts into context, everything we're doing and the process of it. And it sort of almost reinvigorates your approach to it, because it's not just, I'm not just, checking off boxes because I have to get this done today.
Right.
It's sort of, and it's so cool to see somebody hone their craft in that way. But it's also when you see someone really interested in the process and really just wanting to learn, it's a really nice experience to know that you can say like, hey, listen, these are the opportunities that are out there for you. And here's a way that you can help stand out. Or here's, maybe I'm not going to like hold your hand and give you the people to talk to, but like, here's how you can talk to them. Here's the approaches that work. And it's just it feels, like I said, so routine when you keep doing it, but when you have the moment to step outside of that and just see it happen from this sort of like other perspective, it's just really humbling. It's a very cool experience.
Yeah, no, it's really amazing. And just seeing the journey of talented people who maybe, it's also about giving people the tools that you didn't have. I didn't really have like a writing mentor, and writing wasn't something that was like part of my parents weren't authors. It wasn't something that kind of, was passed on. It was something that, we, maybe you're the same, we kind of discovered on our own and just decided I'm a reader, I'm then going to be a writer. So it means a lot to be part of that, somebody else's process. But let's see what these questions are all about. If you're ready for the grilling part of the event. All right. Okay. Ingrid says, you both write graphic novels about characters we've seen in real life already. What's it like to write comics after actors have portrayed them and created a larger audience for them? Does this change your process in any way? That is a great question.
Yeah, it's a really good question.
You want me to go first?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. I mean, I think there was a lot of pressure, especially with Poe. I had to write not only about Poe, but I had to create his origin story, obviously in partnership with Star Wars and Lucasfilm and the story group. And I think the challenge is to make the story count and then make sure that the story feels important and it doesn't retcon anything that came before. It's a little different with Archie. Archie has no hard and fast continuity, whereas with Star Wars, there is a set continuity. Like this free fall is canon. So that means that whatever happens in the book somehow feeds into the later movies and comics. And so it was a lot of research, like reading Charles Soule's and Phil Noto's great Poe Dameron comics, the Greg Rucka novels, and things like Star Wars Aftermath that Chuck Wendig wrote. So it was a lot of research and finding the little spaces that I could add to, and then making sure that the book itself was its own like fun narrative on its own. So I'm sure your experience was a little different, but it's similar too in that these characters are pop culture icons.
Yeah, absolutely. And people have certain levels of expectations, for what they want those characters to say and do. So there's always that little bit of pressure too.
Did you try to evoke Riverdale at all, or was it just kind of church and state for you? Or
not necessarily church and state. I didn't evoke Riverdale as much with Bond of Friendship, just because I feel like it's not necessarily totally different audiences, but it's definitely, I think, even if there's any sort of merging of those audiences, they are also expecting something different from both to some extent. But one thing I've mentioned in the past is I always, when I'm writing, and even when I'm reading, I try to envision it as a movie just to really immerse myself in it. And that's definitely easier because I just have like, oh, it's going to be Lily and Camilla saying these lines. Can I see them talking to each other while they're saying
it was
these?
Definitely easier to have Oscar Isaac reading my dialogue.
Right.
It definitely like visualized it much better than I normally. But do you cast, like when you write fiction, do you cast actors in your stories?
You know what's weird? I don't cast them as much in the stories I write as I do in the stories I read.
Yeah, huh.
So
I do that too. I do that when I read.
Yeah, when I'm reading, I love to like literally once I get introduced to a new character, try and envision, and I often change it. So I'll have an actor, actress in mind, and then like halfway through the book, I realize like, oh, that person wouldn't work for this. Now that I see more of this character, I'm recasting them now.
This is like that scene in Step Brothers where we realize we're best friends. Yeah, no, I do the same thing. I'm like, and it happens to me all the time. Like you're midway through the book and you're like, no, that person now has brown hair, or it just kind of derails you, or they do something that doesn't work. But I do it with stuff I'm writing too, especially in more in prose. But like with the artists, I'll send them reference if I'm working on a comic and I'm thinking of an actor. But that's interesting. Yeah. Let's see what other questions we have. Andrew asks, if you could write the origin story of any character in the Archie universe, which one would you like to explore? You can go first on this one. Yeah.
I'm trying to think because so many characters already had strong origin stories that I wouldn't want to rewrite something that's already happened. But I guess if I were to like put my spin on the character, oh boy. Okay, well, kind of close to that. I've mentioned before that something I do a lot is I love to bring classic, sometimes forgotten Archie characters back into my stories. So I wouldn't say those are origins, but they're kind of reintroductions of characters. And for a lot of them, these were old characters that had, small bit parts, so they never had fully realized personalities. So those are fun to play with because you almost get to like create an origin for them. And an example I always go to is in Vixens. I have the character Evelyn Evernever, who we had only previously seen in Little Archie and a few, one-offs here and there. And she didn't really have a very well-rounded personality. She was just kind of a loner. You had to kind of feel bad for her. She wasn't included. So I turned her into like the wild card of the group. She's you never know what she's going to do next. Her background is very ominous, but like if I had the opportunity to do like a one-shot and just explore any one of those characters with their full background, it would be Evelyn. So
you never know. Yeah.
But it's from this new, different version of her that I don't want to say I completely changed who she was, but I definitely took certain aspects of her character before and just totally amped them up to 11.
Yeah, no, I love that about that story, but it's all, I'm going to piggyback on your answer a little bit. I don't think there's an origin I'm clamoring to tell, but there's definitely, I think one of the things you saw specifically with the Archies is kind of like filling in the spaces between characters. So like bringing in characters like Little Jinx and her friends, and making them like this, like, punk rock band, or, bringing in Katie Keene, or just making it feel like a greater textured universe and just having these characters interact. Because I'm sure you remember this too, as readers, you hardly ever saw Sabrina show up in Riverdale. You never really saw Josie interact with the Archies. That was before our time, like at the company. So those little moments still resonate with me as a reader. So it was kind of things like that, like adding continuity when there really wasn't any, or adding connective tissue between the characters that didn't really have it. That was fun. Not so much origins though. But getting a lot of questions. Let's see. Okay, this is a fun one. What was the first graphic novel you fell in love with?
Does it have to be OGN, or I guess just any sort of?
I would say any comic book. Yeah.
I'm going to go with a very cliche answer, but the one that really got me into everything was Watchmen. Because it was a really interesting to say that, like, hey, a superhero story doesn't have to have all the superhero tropes you expect. You can have this very real look at, the idea of a superhero. And I think that sort of broadened my horizons a lot about what you can do with characters and how comics don't have to be either just, Archie fun and then just standard superhero. So that was definitely my gateway.
Yeah, that was really an eye-opening one. I think that was definitely one for me. And I always go back to Batman Year One, which is, Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's retelling of the origin story, but they do it in such a cinematic, film noir, gritty, realistic way. Like there's no superpowers, there's no supernatural stuff going on. It's very much like it's a crime movie. And I think already being a fan of crime fiction and stuff like that, like reading that, and Mazzucchelli's art is just mind-blowing, like so good. And he's just another big one for me is Love and Rockets, specifically the Jaime Hernandez stuff. you read a lot of comics, but you sometimes don't see characters like you, and seeing like this Latinx community and these characters, like it was less about cape. There's no capes. There's later on he does some superhero stuff, but it's really just real world stories, and that felt so true. And Jaime's art is very inspired by Archie. Like you see a lot of Harry Lucy and DeCarlo in his art style. So that was really, it was like almost like this is the next level of Archie comics. Like having grown up with Archie and then evolving into Love and Rockets, it was interesting to see. So these are very good questions.
Do some covers for us was also.
Yes, that was like a career high point for me. Like he did, what was it, Archie #4? He did this really iconic cover where it's Archie walking by and like the girls are just chatting, and it felt like a blending. And there is a Love and Rockets character if you look closely on that cover. And Tito, who's like one of our longtime Archie staffers, colored it in that classic Archie Digest style. And then he did some other stuff for us, like an Archie's cover, which it was super cool to have Jaime do a cover that I was co-writing. So that was neat. And you probably had moments like that too, where you were working on something and you got a variant in and you're like, oh yeah, wow, this is, yeah. Do any like pop into mind? Or
Vixen's #1, Fiona Staples did a variant for, and that was especially for my first issue.
And that's an iconic cover.
Yeah. That's still.
I did that great Archie's cover where they're like flying on guitars. I don't even know where that came from, but it was like amazing. All right, let's see what else. 1 second. So Jamie, this is for you. Do you have a favorite scene in the book that you were excited to see come to life when Britney drew it?
Gosh, there are so many. I've mentioned outer space a lot. I keep going back to that because that was, a bit of a challenge for me to write because it was so out of my wheelhouse, but it was also one of those, like, Britney really gets to, like, flex her creative muscles here.
Yeah,
and,
for sure.
I was blown away by everything she did with it. And I think most importantly, because it was really cool to see these outer space scenes, but there's a ton of comedic moments that happen. And to have that blend of just, she does such great comedic storytelling in her art, but also in this like beautiful landscape that's one that always stands out to me. There's quite a few in the book, but I always go back to that one because I remember as soon as there's one page and one scene in particular where Betty and Veronica just have a really funny comedic moment. And it's just such a simple panel, but I was excited writing it because I'm like, this has the potential to be really funny, really cute. And then when the art came in, just being floored by how perfect it was.
Yeah, she just nailed it. She nailed it. Yeah, that was great. This is a good one. I guess we could both answer it. What would you recommend someone new to Archie Comics begin with? Like, what would you hand to a potential new Archie reader?
I would say it depends a little bit on what you're looking for.
Yeah.
I can hand you Best of Archie Comics, Volume 1, and that's just a perfect, like, here's every decade, here's something. But especially if you're leaning towards what we've done in the past 5 years and something new, you can't go wrong with Mark Waid and Fiona Staples' first issue of the Archie reboot.
Yeah.
I think it's a good way to sort of introduce the tone that we've sort of set and we work with in a lot of our newer stuff, while still being super accessible and paying homage to classic. I think that's a great starting point if you're interested in, the newer take on them. If you don't want to start, if you don't feel like you have to start with classic, Yeah.
No, those were my answers. Yeah, like a best of classic, and if I could drill down and just do like Harry Lucy, Sam Schwartz, DeCarlo, like those kind of that classic era, not so much the latter DeCarlo work, but that 50s, 60s era, I think would be fantastic. And I would probably hand somebody Afterlife with Archie, just something completely bonkers that is very true to the characters. Like I think that's really the most symbolic book for this new era of Archie, where it's Archie and it's Archie, but it's also completely bonkers. Like it's a zombie apocalypse, but it's definitely those characters.
Definitely. That was a huge help in everything we've done since, because it was just that, like, we've done this, we can do anything,
Yeah, I mean, he's fought zombies, he's met Sharknado, Archie Kiss, it's all happened. So it's okay, as long as it's those characters. So I think we have one more. Oh, no, that's it. So this is great. I thought we had a lot of really awesome questions. I want to remind everyone to please buy a book. You can get a signed copy of, Bond of Friendship or Podameron and Freefall. Just click on this green button. Jamie, did I miss anything? Is there anything you want to touch on? Anything you want to talk about the book before we say our goodbyes?
No, I think we got everything. I mentioned last time too, I always like to give credit just to everyone. So
Yeah.
Britney Williams is a fantastic artist, but we also have the amazing colors from Matt Herms and letters from Jack Morelli, who are just two people that
Two of the
are
best.
fantastic. Yeah. I'd be remiss to not also include them. And just, this is a story that I really feel like can appeal to fans of any age and of any era of Archie. If you're more familiar with the classic stuff, I don't think this is a huge departure. If you're more familiar with the modern, I think this still sort of is in that vein as well. It's just, something I hope everyone can enjoy.
Yeah, definitely. And so many people have already. Cool. Where can people find you online, Jamie?
I'm on Twitter at Jamitha, Jamitha, and on Instagram, Jamie Lee Rotante.
Awesome.
Yeah, where can people find you, Alex?
Yes.
Yeah, you can find me. My website is alexsegura.com or on Twitter at @Alex_Segura. But getting rid of that underscore has been my white whale. Someday.
Debate of your existence one day. You
Yeah,
shall get it.
someday.
Well, I want to say thank you so much for all of the readers for joining us tonight. Thank you so much to Alex and Jamie as well. This was such a pleasure getting to hear you guys talk about such an amazing world that I think has a very near and dear place in all of our hearts. So thank you very, very much. And we will see all of you next time. Don't forget, if you'd like to buy the book, either one of these books, there'll be the link down below. And also, if you want to replay, rewatch, or share the event with anyone you know, there'll be a replay going up like 5 seconds after we say goodbye to you guys. So thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you all next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.